Mercedes is capable of engineering extraordinary powertrains, and there are lots of existing examples already out there. A V8 is their specialty, the most typical layout for an automobile with a three-pointed star. It started with the original M100 A portion of the popularity also ascribes to the M156 6.2 liter, but it is the M113K that stuck in the memory and heart of most people. It's big, beefy, torquey, and not many competitors can rival the deep baritone of a supercharged AMG V8. Many of you pointed out the M113 and its qualities, so I decided to look at this remarkable Mercedes engine. In the 1990s, this Stuttgart-based company went through many major events. First, a model branding changed from alphanumerical combinations to classes as we know them today, introducing the first Gen C class in 1993 alongside. Additionally, the rounded-off, boxy design was coming to an end, as it had been the identity of Mercedes-Benz by Brunal since 1975. Finally, there was an acquisition of the AMG company before the end of the millennium, previously an independent tuning firm specializing mostly in Mercedes models. What's more, a new modular engine series was being finished and gradually implemented into new models from 1998 onwards. A V6 came first, the M112, and then it was followed by a V8, the famous M113 that ranged from 4.3 through supercharged 5.4s up to the 6.1 liter in the very special editions. Mercedes being Mercedes, it did not stop at the 8-pot, and an M137 V12 was made as well, loosely using the design of the previous two. However, we might speak about that one in a future video. Now back to the M113. The new M113 replaced a larger M119 V8 that had more valves, more displacement in a top trim, and eventually a racing version with a turbocharger. The M113 lacked a huge variant like a 6 liter, and even with just a single overhead cam, there are lots of aspects to praise it for. To begin with, just take the weight. A 5 liter M113 tips the scale at 206 kilograms, while the M119 is nearly 240 kilograms. As mentioned, the base was shared with the V6, such as the aluminum block cast into a 90-degree angle, having alusil cast-in liners spaced 106mm from each other. The cylinders were covered by heads that were quite different from the M119. They were cast of aluminum too, but there was only a single cam, 3-valve setup, and twin spark plugs per cylinder. Roller rockers and hydraulic lifters were standard, greatly improving the lifespan and service life of the M113. The result of a single exhaust valve was less heat emitted into the head and more into the catalyst, getting it up to the temperature sooner. The exhaust valves were sodium filled, and this was one of the reasons why the engine weighed less than the M119. The twin spark setup increased the heat load of pistons, which was compensated for with oil jets. Amongst engine variants of the M113, internals varied in size and strength, but generally they are cast aluminum pistons with iron-coated skirts, fracture-split forged steel conrods, cast camshafts, and a magnesium variable length intake. Naturally aspirated engines tend to have pistons with high compression and weaker rods because of an oiling port. In the beginning, the entry-level version of the series was introduced, being a 4.3 liter with a cylinder size of 89.9 by 84mm. It was less oversquare than its predecessor. It had the smallest pistons, a compression ratio of 10:1, and 279 horsepower at 5700 rpm, identical to a 4.2 liter M119 with a high compression ratio. This was the least expensive way to get the new V8 in 1997, and it actually powered also an AMG. It was a C43 rated at 306 horsepower as a successor of a straight-six M104 powered C36 AMG. A middle-sized trim of the M113 was a 5-liter that shared the crankshaft stroke with the 4.3 but received wider pistons of 90-70mm. The power output increased marginally, but the torque difference was significant. Its peak came in from 2700 RPM and optionally there was a cylinder deactivation. The 5-liter was not an AMG motor in any model, its larger brother took care of that. Known as a 55 AMG engine, the largest M113 available was a 5.4 liter. Its cylinders shared the piston size with the 5 liter, but the crankshaft was swapped for a 92mm stroker rather than 84. The base difference compared to the previous engines is that this was an AMG developed motor and manufactured in a different factory in Affalterbach. There are discussions on the internet about whether the 5.4 liter has got forced internals, but no certain answer seems to exist anywhere. What's for sure is a different crankshaft and the fact that some tuners like AMG or Kleemann developed supercharger kits for the M113 5.4. From 2005 onwards, a different crankshaft ball pattern had been implemented gradually. The naturally aspirated 5.4 ranged from 350 to 370 horsepower. The most powerful trim appeared in the SLK 55 AMG Black series and had just over 400 horsepower. These gains were also achieved thanks to a larger intake plenum and freer flowing exhaust. The 5.4 was manufactured from 1997 up to 2010, but AMG saw potential in a dedicated supercharged motor. Mercedes has got plenty of experience with superchargers, and the M113K was one of those engines, which from 2002 to 2011 received the famous compressor signature on the back. The engine displacement was identical to the NA 5.4, but the supercharger unit is very different inside out. The crankcase received stiffening ribs and side bolts for extra strength. In addition, AMG put a tougher crankshaft in, more rigid con rods, and stronger deep dish pistons and thicker wrist pins. As a result, the compression ratio dropped from 11 to 9 to 1. The compressor engine has got a reworked fueling and oiling system. The heads were optimized as well, not only for a better airflow, but also more revs to benefit from. The camshafts were lighter and more aggressive, and the valve springs were stiffened up to hold up the additional RPM. The peak power moved from 5600 to 6100 RPM. The massive increase in torque from 530 to 720 Nm was a cherry on the cake. Not to forget, all these modifications were done to allow a large 2.1 liter twin-screw IHI supercharger to work flawlessly at 0.8 bar of boost. Its Teflon-coated aluminum shafts were able to spin at 23,000 RPM, moving up to half a kilogram of air every second. The air was cooled by twin water-to-air intercoolers, which required a water pump. This pump often fails, so keep your eyes on that. The supercharger worked only at certain RPM and load conditions, and the on-off boost situation was operated by an electromagnetic coupling and a recirculating flap. The output of the M113K started at 479 horsepower, but with upgrades in post-2006 models, like a reworked intake and larger throttle body, it raised just over 500 horsepower. The CLK DTM AMG received the most powerful iteration with various mods, resulting in 582 horsepower and 800 Nm of torque. The pinnacle of the M113 series was launched in 2003. Mercedes owned a 40% stake in McLaren at the time, and they were ready to show off. a special joint Brit-German venture that needed an extraordinary engine, the M155. It shares nothing with the M156 if you wonder. Being purely based on the M113K, the cylinder size was identical, but everything else was pretty much unique. Pistons, conrods, valve train, and even the lubrication system being a dry sump. The stiffened up block gained a closed deck design for additional rigidity. The intake was modified too, with a larger 80mm throttle body, and the front Mercedes-Benz sign was an actual inlet to the engine. It was as much as 1 meter away from the V8, and the whole engine was about half a meter further back from the front axis. This decision required a special design of the firewall, as the engine was tucked down deep under the windscreen. It had a bit low compression ratio, a rev range up to 7000 rpm and up to 650 horsepower in the most aggressive setup. The short cramped exhaust system exiting behind the front wheels was a remarkable design feature of both models, receiving the M155, the SLR McLaren and SLR Stirling Moors. Interestingly, many seem to like the M113 over the newer, higher revving M156. There are several factors contributing to this fact. The first one is crucial and perhaps the most important thing for a customer, and that's reliability and quality. While the M156 has got many serious issues and expensive consumables such as camshafts, the M113K suffers from rather trivial problems. There are known leaks from a rear main crankshaft seal. Then the compressor variants usually suffer from failed intercooler pumps, leading to high temperature of the charged air, lower power, and often a supercharger shutdown. It is advised to replace it with a Bosch O10 or other aftermarket units, especially in case of a boost above OE levels. Last but not least, amongst problems of the M113, which are often mentioned but hardly serious, are spark plugs. They tend to wear out a bit sooner than expected, but nothing catastrophic. A 50,000 mile interval should be no big deal, but keep in mind that there are 16 of them and often fail quicker with higher boost. Other than that, the M113 is rock solid, reliable engine. They are getting over 2 decades old though, so frankly anything can pop up and fail. The second best thing people love about the M113 is torque, mainly what the M113K is capable of. They are incredibly smooth, brutal sound-wise, and provide tons of torque everywhere in the rev range. One could even say that this is a masterpiece by AMG. A masterpiece that BRABUS later turned into a 5.8 and also a 6.1 liter CV8 version.